It's now my very great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today. As you know, we do have a tradition at these events of introducing a keynote who comes from another institution, who provides us with some provocation, some thought, and some insights. And I'm very pleased to say that we've managed to invite and bring along a keynote speaker who I think will do exactly that for us today. He's Professor Gregor Kennedy. Gregor is the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Educational Innovation at the University of Melbourne. He's also a professor in the Melbourne Centre for the Study for Higher Education. He's not going to thank me for reading all of this out, but it is very important that we situate his credibility with an audience of learning professionals. He leads the university's strategy in curriculum innovation, technology-enhanced learning, learning and assessment, MOOCs, and learning analytics, and the use of physical and virtual space. So all of which are important agenda items for us in terms of driving an agenda around teaching excellence. He's spent 15 years conducting research and overseeing research and development in educational technology and higher education. I'm pleased to say I've known Gregor probably for at least 10 of those years and have always found that what he has to say both compelling and intriguing. His current research interests include students' motivation and self-regulation, interaction and engagement in digital environments, understanding confusion and the provision of feedback to students engaged in digital tasks. He's interested in and researching the use of 3D immersive simulation for learning, and the use of learning analytics for improved learning design, teaching, and student support. Gregor has also published widely in these areas, and again, I would urge you, if you get the opportunity, to go and look up some of Gregor's work and read some of what it is that, some of the things that he's put down. Gregor has also been a past editor of the Australasian Journal of Educational Technology, which for a number of us is one of the single most important journals in this particular area of our work. He's regularly invited to conferences, to keynote and speak internationally, I might add. And we're very fortunate that he was able to come and join us today. He is also educated in the Jesuit tradition in the Catholic school system, so he has a little bit of resonance and understanding about us and some of what it is we stand for. And on that point, I might step away and ask you to join me in welcoming Gregor Kennedy.
Let me get myself sorted. That's very embarrassing. I said it last night when Kevin introduced me to something else, that it's always very embarrassing to hear those kind of welcome remarks, but thank you. I do appreciate them. And thank you all for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here. And can I just say that it's a hugely impressive turnout, and just wonderful to see so many people in the room committed to the agenda of teaching and learning in this institution. It's a real credit to you. So I was thinking about how to start the talk, and I was talking with my colleague David Israel down in Melbourne, and he said, "Well, surely you start with a joke." And I said, "Oh, listen, the title of the talk is Messiah or Myth. I think I'm on dodgy ground already." And thankfully, Kevin mentioned my Jesuit credentials. I was educated in the Jesuit tradition, and my father is a great Ignatian educator, so I feel, I can take some license there. But I didn't think I could start with a joke, and as I was looking over my notes just at the table before, I couldn't help but notice that Father Anthony and Kevin were enjoying a joke about comparative differences between religions, and so I thought I couldn't do that because I'd steal their thunder as well. And I want to start by also saying that there's a danger with these kind of talks, particularly to a crowd such as this, who are people who are passionate and keen and interested in teaching and learning. There's always a danger of telling you what you know, so I'm apologetic in advance for maybe telling you things that you already know. And looking across the program for today's activities, there is some really interesting and obviously innovative work going on in your community, and I look forward to hearing more about it. So, let's start with put those side comments aside and start with what we're going to be talking about today. So the Messiah or myth, the core values of technology in university education. I'm going to speak, I think, for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to leave quite a substantial amount of time for questions, so I'm looking forward to a chat afterwards. So this is where I come from. Many of you, I'm sure, would know the University of Melbourne. It's a great institution in my esteem. It's an institution that is sitting on the edge of a major metropolitan city, one of the most livable cities in the world, and certainly sells itself in the sandstone tradition. And for us, and for many of us in the room, I think going to university is something like this, or it conjures up an image of place, an image of students lounging on a lawn, not doing any study, and engaging in the undergraduate experience, whatever that means. And if you go to the ACU website, similar images of students not engaging in study, sitting on a lawn, although the people down here maybe are engaging in some sort of problem-solving exercise. But the point is that I think that we have notions of what going to university is about. And I think that really, over the last 20 years, the concept or the idea of going to university has changed. And I want to take you through some of the arguments that I've been making in recent times about why I think going to university has changed. The first is around the issues of higher education policy and changes. And these were really brought into the mainstream through the higher education reforms that many people would know as the Dawkins reforms of around 1989 with the Labor government. And associated with those reforms and more progressive reforms over the ensuing years with the Howard government in '96 particularly, these reforms really revolutionised the ways in which we engaged in teaching and learning and higher education, the way in which the sector was operating. So we moved from an elite system to a mass participation system of education. We changed and shifted to a much more vocationally oriented education system. And over the course of the periods, of course, the fundamental aspect of those reforms, those Dawkins reforms, were about the HEC system, and students were increasingly paying for their higher education provision. The public purse devoted to higher education changed. And as a result, universities suddenly were asked to compete much more in order to generate revenue. And this became an increasingly globalised phenomenon as international students became one of the areas that institutions would seek to increase their scale and participation from international students. And so these things really radically transformed the way in which we thought about going to university. At the same time, or slightly after those changes of 1989, was of course the birth of the internet. So when I started working in 1999, the internet was just on the horizon, and it started being applied to higher education context fairly soon after that, admittedly in a fairly clunky way. But just after the reforms in higher education policy, we saw the rise of the internet, rapid technological change, and then the introduction of online learning, and then the maturation of online learning that we really have seen expand in the last 5 years. The rise of social networks, a range of technologies coming over the horizon that are impacting on what we were doing, ending with maybe the open educational resources movement, mobile technologies, and finally, MOOCs, alternative forms of credentialing, and nano degrees. So hopefully these things are sort of broadly familiar to you. What I want to argue in the first part of this talk is that the changes at the top part of the slide created significant challenges for university, particularly in terms of costs, in terms of access and opening access and quality. And the changes and the innovations at the bottom half of the slide, these ones here, were rightly or wrongly often seen as a way in which you could solve some of the problems that had emerged from these changes in the higher educational system. And this is where the title of the talk comes into play, is that what I'm arguing, and dare I say it in the Vice-Chancellor's introduction to our conference today, there's something about the way in which we see the rise of technology as solving some of the problems that have emerged from a changing socio-political landscape. And what I want to argue in this talk is that, that there's some difficulties with that. Now, you don't have to look too far to think about this. It's not administrators such as myself, or I also count myself as a researcher and a teacher, but often in the products that we see and we get sold to by vendors. This is from Blackboard. I don't think you guys are on Blackboard. You're a Moodle sort of outfit, aren't you? So this is obviously not applies to you. But in this brochure, you can see how Blackboard is really selling the idea of fostering student engagement. And I'm not sure that you can see it up on the slide, but you can't, is it says, next generation teaching and learning platform. There's something about the progressiveness of this. It's going to be the next generation. It's going to get us to where we want to be. And also up here, exciting new social and teaching tools to foster more logical, visibly impactful and active learning opportunities. Exciting new social and teaching tools to foster more logical, visually impactful and active learning opportunities. That's a big sell. I mean, that's really saying something about what this software tool is going to do for you. And in this report, you can see it really being brought home. I think this is an Ernst & Young report. It tells you what the university is going to look like in the future. It's got young, I hope these kids are not at university yet. Well, maybe there's an elite program that is being run somewhere. And it really is juxtaposing this idea of the old needing to catch up world institution that is sort of outdated or will soon be outdated because these kids are coming over the horizon. And a little bit again, in terms of what Professor Craven was saying, the expectations that they have is meaning that the thing on the right-hand side of the slide is somehow in trouble. 1,000-year-old industry on the cusp of profound change. So that this is in the rhetoric that I'm sure you're very aware of. And this is very much in line with, again, what Professor Craven was saying about digital disruption, the idea of digital disruption, which hopefully we can pick up in question time because I have some significant concerns about the concept. And my argument is, as you might be coming to become aware of, is that this is something of a myth. And the reason that I think that it's a myth is that in my experience, in my research and my professional opinion, educational technology has really failed to live up to the promise that is being made. Educational technology has not revolutionised or fundamentally transformed teaching, learning and assessment in universities. And universities have not done a particularly good job of using technologies in systemic ways to enhance and support teaching, learning and assessment. So that's maybe a big call, but that's what I think. And it's not just me that thinks this. There's two quotes up on the screen for you, one from Gregor, who's a world-leading expert in educational technology, and also Neil Selwyn, who comes from the UK but is a resident in Monash University at the moment. So Gregor says quite a while ago now, I mean it's over 10 years ago, marginal in the lives of academics, technology being used for little more than acting as a content repository and for administrative purposes. Where Neil goes a little bit further, computer technologies in many areas of higher education could be best described as sporadic, uneven, or even low level. So these are people who are recognised experts in the area of educational technology internationally who are saying that it hasn't really lived up to its promise. So what I want to focus on in the second part of the talk is, given that there is this promise, why is it that educational technologies have been more myth than messiah in their transformation of teaching and learning and assessment? Why is it that we have such difficulties with the potential and the power of technology and the way in which they have been so clearly been transformational in some industries? Why is there a little bit of a difficulty in the higher education or even the education sector in the transformational capacity of technologies and educational technologies? And the first reason that I think is that we tend to focus on the wrong thing. We busily doing something on one part of the institution when really there's something going on behind our backs that we should be really paying a little bit more attention to. And I was saying last night to a small group at dinner that the ways in which we've approached this question at the University of Melbourne, and this is just a framework that I used when I first came into the role quite some time ago, is to really be a bit more critical and sophisticated about what we think are the value and values of educational technology in our institutions. Because I think that often we think of educational technologies or the use of technologies as one thing. We're sort of going to say, oh yeah, we're going to adopt e-learning or we're going to go online without really thinking about what that means. And so I'm going to quickly take you through this fourfold classification, which is as sort of simple as it is incomplete. It's not meant to be earth-shattering and it's not meant to be comprehensive. But I present it to you as a way of stimulating discussion and debate about why we're doing what we're doing with technologies in our institutions. So the first quadrant here, quadrant number 1, is management and administration of teaching and learning. And this is one of the great benefits of technology in our institutions. So the ways in which we use things like learning management systems and other administrative systems is a real boon in the way in which we use technologies in higher education. So learning management systems are a great example in teaching of learning of how we've got a piece of software that allows us to manage and administer students, classes, teachers, resources, assessments in a really effective and efficient way. It's hard to imagine how an institution would run, a higher education institution would run without a learning management system this day, predominantly because it does such a good job in management and administration of teaching and learning. The second area, which again is the technology is very, very good at, is for the sending and receiving of resources for teaching and learning that support teaching and learning. So, did anyone used to put together a reading pack, photocopy it, print it, shove it in the library or in the front office and ask students to come and pay $5? Does anyone still do it? No, I'm serious. That's an interesting question. Does anyone still do that? I know don't worry. Yeah, there might be people that still do that. And there are, I know in the book room at Melbourne University, there are still scads and scads of reading packs, which is interesting because I think the students still like the printed document. But the point of quadrant 2 is that, and the soft laughter around the room, it's seen as archaic because technology is such a wonderful resource for the delivering and receiving. What we used to print out and go and get photocopied and bound and then ask students to pay a fiver for, we're now just putting up online and students are defraying it costs to students in a different way. They're asked to download it or read it online. And this is just a classic example of the ways in which technology is really wonderful for the delivering and receiving and the exchange of resources. And it's not just printed material, of course, it's videos, it's audios, it's assessments, it's a whole range of things that once we had alternative mechanisms of doing that. The third quadrant is really what I call the sort of the money quadrant. This is really the thing that the vendor documents, the vendor pamphlets, when people talk about technology, teaching and learning, they really are selling the idea of quadrant 3. The idea that technology has some role in genuinely interactive, deeply generative, profound teaching, learning and assessment experiences. There's some idea, and I'll show you some examples later in the talk of how this is possible, that technology can not just support good learning experiences, but there's something about technology when used well that can add something extra, that you can use technology to do something that otherwise is not possible. And there are examples of this, and I'll show you some later. And so this is really quadrant 3, the area that is sold, the area that we gravitate towards, and the raison d'etre, if you want, of the reason why we often think about using technology in university settings. And the fourth quadrant is scholarly inquiry and research. And I put this in here because of changes in the ways in which we have thought about teaching and learning really since the 60s and 70s. Changes in pedagogical models and contemporary pedagogical models which have adopted more inquiry-based models or problem-based models, student-centred models, which have put students in a position to do more inquiry. So in the undergraduate years as well as the graduate programs, students are asked to do much more inquiry and research. Not that they didn't do it before, but it's become much more of an emphasis. And as a result, they need resources to do that. And one of the areas that technology, are there librarians in the room? One of the areas that technology is fundamentally impacted is the library and the ways in which libraries operate in our communities, in our intellectual communities, in our scholarly communities. And libraries have been, in my estimation, at the forefront of the change agenda here. They've been institutions within our institutions that have really done a great job of working out what their position is with digital technologies. So online journals and a whole range of other resources that libraries have embraced. But in addition to libraries, you don't have to work too hard to think about the impact of Google and Wikipedia on the ways in which students are undertaking their scholarly inquiries. Just as a side point, Terry Judd and I published a paper looking at medical students' use of digital technologies in their problem-based curricula and self-directed learning. So we had their search techniques of a range of resources that were available to them through the problems of the week. So problems of the week where they have a clinical problem and they have to go off and investigate it in 3 days and then come back and they resolve the problem somehow. And they've got, NCBI or medical journals or the library system or Google or Wikipedia or CAL resources all at their fingertips and digital fingertips and disposals. In first year, 70% of the resources that students used were Google or Wikipedia based. And that attenuated to third year to something like 34%. But it shows you, and that's a good news story in a way because we're having some impact on them in terms of authoritative resources. But it just shows you in that fourth quadrant just the kind of things, and we've published a paper called the satisficing. I don't know if people know about the term satisficing. It's near is good enough kind of concept. Satisficing searching of medical students. Anyway, I digress. But those are the four quadrants. So going back to we tend to focus on the wrong thing. If I have this fourfold classification system up there, I think we do a pretty good job in 1, 2 and 4. The university sectors and universities generally do a pretty good job in their use of technology in these 3 areas. But what I think we don't do such a good job is in quadrant 3. We need to focus more on the ways in which we use technology to support those genuinely interactive learning, teaching and assessment exercises. And remember what I said before, which is the thing that we most care about. It's not the other ones aren't important, but the ones that the vendors sell us products on, the ones that we talk about, the things that we think are important, is quadrant 3. And partly we don't do that because it's difficult, because it's time-consuming, because it requires often a team-based approach. It's a tricky endeavour to do. And I want to talk about that first term in quadrant 3, which is the interactive component of it. So interaction and interactivity is key, and I want to talk about a little bit the way in which we think about interaction and interactivity, and then move into some examples of how that is instantiated in examples of educational technology in higher education. So people might be familiar with Michael Moore, who wrote in 1989 an editorial piece in, I think it was Distance Education, a journal, a North American journal, where he came up with a classification of types of interaction that people can have in online environments, distance environments, which is equally applied to just digital environments, which is teacher-learner, learner-learner, and learner-content interactions. And I want to briefly explain what each of those sort of mean. So teacher-learner interactions, there's many examples that I could use to articulate this point, but people know Diana Laurelard's work. So this is the second edition of her book, Rethinking University Teaching. In that book, the original and the second edition, she presents the conversational framework. The conversational framework just makes an argument as to the importance of the discursive dialogue that exists between teacher and learner in coming to a shared, or the individual changing their understanding of some concept. So in this remarkably sort of simple and denuded representation of Diana's framework, so I apologise and have apologised to her for. The idea is that the teacher, and this would be very well known to you as teachers, you present a concept, this is how photosynthesis works. The student reflects on that in number 2 and thinks, all right, I think that this is what the teacher said about how photosynthesis works. The learner then plays that back and says, this is what I understand you to be saying. And the teacher says, sort of, not quite. Let me think about what you're saying. Oh, okay, I'll add a little bit more so you really understand what I'm saying. And the cycle goes around and around and around. And that's the epitome of high quality teaching and learning practice, where there's a dialogue and an exchange between the teacher and the learner about some concept or principle or topic. The second one is learner-learner interaction, and this is where we can easily bring in the big guns of psychology and education. The social learning theories that I'm sure many of you are aware of, I've put Vygotsky and Piaget up on the screen there, and they have slightly different perspectives on why interactions between peers, interactions between learners is such an important component of learning and a teaching and learning experience. So Vygotsky's view is much more about co-construction of knowledge and intra-individual conflict, somebody working out within themselves how some concept is being developed in their own head, and then a reciprocal sense-making process between individuals. Whereas Piaget is a little bit more combative, which is a little bit like the two heads are better than one kind of argument, where if you disagree with somebody, then you're going to come to some better understanding through that disagreement. And that results in some sort of cognitive change. The point of the story here is that learner-learner interaction has been, and that social interaction in learning environments has been a bedrock of what we think about as a high-quality educational practice. The final type of interaction is learner-content interaction. And for the educational technologists in the room, this has got a long-standing history in the idea of somehow the way in which you design content having some impact on a learner that is an interaction between the individual and some sort of artefact. And it's that interaction that you're starting to talk about here. It's not a person, it's some sort of other artefact. When I first started out, there was a number of these. I started out as really fundamentally being interested in the idea of interactivity, because interactive multimedia was top of the pops. It was the MOOC of the day. And so I delved quite deeply into a whole range of frameworks that tried to really tease out what it is about the interaction between the individual and the artefact. In this case, some piece of media. And one of my favourites is Schweier and Muschenchuk, if I can say that name correctly. And they developed a continuum, which is like Thompson and Jorgensen, like many other ones, even Rod Sims in the Australian context, which has sort of a continuum approach to what it is about the interaction between the individual and the artefact, in this case the media. At one end of the spectrum we have reactive, which is very much like an instructionist thing. You're just basically taking content out of a media system. And then you have proactive, which is where there is a genuine dialogue. And then mutual, which is an interesting one, which gets us into thoughts about adaptation and adaptive computing, where the individual is inputting into the system and the system is changing on the basis of what the individual puts into the system, modifying what it does, and then providing something back to the user. The user does something else and then inputs into the system, and the system changes and provides something back to the user. So this is very much the idea of adaptive computing. So there are three types of classifications of interaction. And going back to the question about, given the promise, why have educational technologies been more myth than messiah? The second part of the reason why is that I often think that while we often understand that these kind of interactions are important, we don't explicitly design for interactions in the way in which we construct our teaching, learning and assessment environments. So what I'm going to do for the next bit of the talk, and I presume we've got a lot of time because I think Kevin gave me something like 4 hours to talk today. I wish. I don't wish. I can tell you I don't wish. Is what I'm going to do is go through a number of examples. Now, the examples come really from my history. I started my career in educational technology and academia. My background is in psychology, but then I moved across campus and started working in the health sciences for a while. And so most of the examples will come from my health sciences, where I worked for 15 years running R&D labs in health sciences in ed tech. So that's that bit of it. And the other thing is that they're intentionally historic. They're not meant to be cutting-edge examples. I'm not here, as you would probably tell from the tenor of the way in which I talk, I'm not here to tell you about the latest and greatest things. There's method in my madness, and that will be shown to you at the end. So before you jump up and down and say, they're really crap examples or something, there's a reason for it. All right, here are some examples. The first one is an interactive multimedia program that I developed with James Iagas and Michael Liu and Avril Martinelli a long time ago in the area of pharmacokinetics, so first order, second order kinetics, the way in which drugs get into your body and are out of your body. And so this program was an interactive multimedia program that allowed students to explore these ideas, pretty complex pharmacokinetics ideas about dose, volume of distribution and clearance, and things like half-life and peak plasma concentration. What the academic experts found is that students would remember formulas, memorise formulas about pharmacokinetics principles, but would have no understanding of what the formulas meant. And so this was really brought home to them, is that the students would do this in first year chemistry, where they'd memorise first year chemistry formulas in the context of chemistry, and then would come to the second year subject, which was this subject, and Michael and Jimmy would say, so you learnt that formula in first year chemistry about T1 and T2. Now we're in pharmacokinetics, completely different discipline, but just tell us what you understood was the underpinning of that formula. And A, they'd forgotten the formula from their first year chemistry, and B, they had no idea about what the principle that underpinned the formula was. So Jimmy and Mike took a different approach to this, which was to really emphasise the conceptual understanding, not put any formulas in the program, and allow students to explore through real-life examples and analogies and interactive tasks the ways in which pharmacokinetic principles worked through a simulation-based task, a predict, observe, explain task. And the thing that I'll draw your attention to is the bottom left of the slide. This is with second year science and biomedicine students at Melbourne. The case study that they used was how alcohol goes into your body and is exited from your body. In the context of two people going to the pub, one person not drinking, the other person drinking and getting breathalyzed and crashing their car into a lamppost, and a simulation that allowed them to manipulate age, male, female, number of drinks, whether you had a meal, whether you'd had a sleep, and getting them to think in a really innovative way about pharmacokinetic concepts, but in an example that is accessible to most second year students. Even if they didn't drink, they could sort of understand that there was something that was happening at university where many first year students would, or second year. So what we did is we tested this. I'm going to go through some data. I like data, and I like sort of giving some evaluation so that it makes me sound like I know what I'm talking about. And the data that you often see with these kind of evaluations of educational technology is sort of, did they like it and did they learn something from it? And I'm going to try and do that each time, I think. So with the students, did they like it? One of the evaluations we did was with 173 medical students in this problem-based learning curriculum. And we firstly just asked, how useful was this resource compared to the other resources that you had? And you can see there that it's rated as the most useful resource. And again, not to make the librarians depressed, but the journal articles are down there at 4.04. So they liked it. They thought it was a useful resource. It hit the target for whatever the problem of the week was. Now, that's hardly surprising. It was a resource for a particular problem of the week. But with the same set of students, we also asked them about their knowledge before and after and their confidence before and after. And not only did we get a knowledge gain, but we got also a very strong confidence gain, and is that students were reporting that they felt that they knew much more about the area. So these were pleasing results. Here's another interactive multimedia example in a different area. So the reason that I've got a brain up on the screen is that this was part of a study that my colleagues Barney and Sue and I have been doing for a while, where Barney had a crazy idea at an Ascolite conference once on the last day. I remember it distinctly. It was one like the students sitting on the lawn. We were sitting on the lawn. We weren't working. And Barney said, what we really need to do to get to resolve this question is get a whole lot of students and put them in an fMRI scanner while they're using interactive multimedia. And then we'll know if there's a difference in the way in which the learning design of the interactive multimedia. And me and Sue said, that is a stupid idea. That will never work. And he said, but will you do it with me? And we said, of course we will. And we got money for it. So we did this study, and what I'm really going to show you is not any pictures of people's brains or anything like that, but what I am going to show you is a study that we did after that using the same protocols that we designed for that study. And the key research question that we had here is, how does the learning design of different interactive multimedia programs impact and affect students' learning approaches and their outcomes? And before I go on, is anyone going to comment on how wonderfully visually appealing the designs of these interactive multimedia programs are? Terrible, I hear from my right, which is true. Now, so you don't think that I'm a complete Luddite and awful at visual design. The reason that they're like this is that when you do put somebody in an fMRI scanner and you're looking to see activation patterns, basically how their brain is working within the scanner, it's very easy to fire off and activate the brain, particularly if you've got a lot of things, sensory information coming on. So the idea was to completely flatten the two multimedia programs in terms of their visual appeal. So basically we didn't fire off the visual cortex. And you'll also see that they're designed in a way that is, these are two different protocols, two different multimedia tools. They're designed in a way that is almost identical in terms of their visual appeal, so that we can control across conditions to make sure that that visual aspect of it was consistent across conditions. So that's my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. So I'm going to take you briefly through the two learning designs of this program. They're very, very similar. There's the exploration learning design, which is again based on predict, observe, explain, sort of Bruner kind of notions and conceptual simulation. There's a series of content screens where there's a background to the information, and then there's this task where students have to go through a predict, observe, explain, where they have to make a prediction in the area of global warming or blood alcohol concentration. They have to make a prediction as if they change a parameter, what would happen. They observe what would happen, and then they have to explain whether or not there was a disparity between their prediction and what they saw in the data output. And so students were able in this first learning design to make a number of manipulations to the parameters that you can see up there with the red arrows going up and down. Does that make sense? Yeah? Is everyone with me on that one? I don't feel like I explained that particularly well. The second one was almost identical, same content and background streams, introduction to the terminology, but then it was a page-turning task. It was like a traditional old interactive multimedia where you sort of click next, click next, click next, click next. So the content on the screens was broadly equivalent to the previous exploratory design, but students were not able to manipulate any of the parameters. They were manipulated for students. And they would see what the impact of those manipulations were. So we did a crossover design. Each student's completed one of two programs, a tutorial in one content area and then an exploration condition in the other content area. And we logged students' behaviour using learning analytics within the program. Okay, so does that all make sense? Which would be better, exploration or page turner? Who says exploration? Who says page turner? That's what we thought would happen as well. I hate research. You know, you put your heart and... Oh no, it's probably not the time or the place. So we were really bummed out, you know. There was no statistical difference between students in the tutorial or the exploration condition on that global warming one. And there was only this really modest difference on the blood alcohol one. And so we thought, oh well, there's another 6 months of research down the drain. But then Barney and I were looking at the log file, the outcomes, and seeing that there was quite a bit of variance in one particular group. So we noticed that there was a bit of variation in the post-test scores for the students who were in the exploration condition. So there was people that did really well and people that did really appallingly. Well, appallingly is probably too strong, did badly. And so what we did is this statistical technique called eyeballing, where we looked at the log files of what students were doing just within that exploration condition to see what they were doing and how they were manipulating the parameters. And it seemed that some were being a bit more systematic than others in that. And so we did a cluster analysis, a number of things, but we basically classified students according to a simple rule as to how they used the simulation, whether it was systematic or not, which is basically amounted to the number of changes they made before looking at the results, whether they made a lot or whether they manipulated many variables. Oh, here it is up on the screen. So systematic explorations were students who consistently completed simulation cycles of that predict, observe, explain bit, but they only changed one variable at the time. Where non-systematic were all the other people, and then the tutorial we just left as the same because it was just a page turner anyway, because they didn't have a simulation. So the systematic people were going, I'm going to change this variable, I'm going to see the result, change this variable, see the result. And the non-systematic were, which is probably more like me. Right. Voila. So what we found is when we characterised that exploration group as systematic or non-systematic, that these really clear differences started to emerge, significant differences on both global warming and blood alcohol. And you can see there that the green is significantly different from the other two. And the other two, the blue and the red, when you're using an exploration tutorial effectively in an unsystematic way, it's effectively like using a page turner tutorial. And so these started to be useful and pleasing results for us. Okay. Example 2. How am I going for time? You said so. Yeah. So example 2 is, I was thinking about what kind of example to present, and it reminded me of, people might know Matt Riddle, who works at La Trobe. He's an old friend. I went to primary school with Matt, and is the director of e-learning and learning technologies at La Trobe. When he was at Melbourne University, he created what was then quite an innovative program in the early days of the internet, which was in the law school, which was an authentic environment for law students where they would go through an inquiry-based learning project where they acted as a solicitor or acted as a client in a particular case, where they had to go through and gather evidence about a particular case and go through the process that they would go through if they were a solicitor or a lawyer, and compile the evidence and forms and bureaucracy that they needed to prosecute this case in an online environment. And the lecturer in charge would perform a number of roles with them online, where they would release different material, would say, now that the bailiff's report is now available, you need to pick that up and make a judgment about it or go and have a review of it. And then there would be possibly that they would have to request more information, so that they would request that information. The lecturer in charge would act as the person who was the court reporter or whoever it was and provide this information, or the immigration officer will provide this information. And it just reminded me of how online learning with these tools that we have available to us, if you get those kind of authentic designs right, can be really quite a powerful tool. So this is a long time ago. It's called Drail System. Still exists at the University of Melbourne, and it was published at Ascalot a long time ago. But it just did remind me that, again, if we have a clear idea about problem-based learning and the power that we can get out of providing students with ill-structured problems or scenarios that are used as a vehicle for developing their understanding of concepts, principles, or processes. And they're variously labelled problem-based, scenario-based, authentic-based, and role-play. And it also reminds me of a similar program that was at Monash University that I can't remember the name of the woman, but she presented what was a really compelling case for problem-based learning and role-play, where she had a child with a health issue that was presented to a group of students, not many students, it was about 46 students, online, and over the 12-week period of this case unfolding, for the individual child who had some compromised health condition, the students were asked to rotate through groups where for the individual case, as the case progressed, they would take the role of the doctor, the nurse, the social worker, the parent, the teacher of the child at school and negotiating with the school, and the child themselves over the course of this 12-week semester. And it was just such a powerful way of getting somebody to understand not just the principles associated with whatever health condition the kid was compromised with, but also the way in which the health system works and the various tensions and bargains and negotiations and bureaucracy that was operating around this individual. It just struck me as a really compelling and rich learning environment. And the reason that I described those two cases in some detail is you could do it with email. It's tech light. There's not much in that is about Google Maps or 3D immersive environments or Twitter. This is something that we can obviously do with the systems that you guys have got today, that everybody really has today. And I think that that's worth reflecting on. Speaking of social media and Twitter, the third example is in the area of social media and Twitter. So people will be very well aware of social media. I won't go into great detail. Some of the icons on the screen that you would be familiar with. The case that I want to present to you is something that we developed as part of a national project which is called Educating the Net Generation. And this was with Barney Delgado and Andrea up in Charles Sturt University. So in that we had a range of social Web 2 technologies, social media technologies, that at the time we were trying to work out what's the advantage of these things in higher education settings. And this was in the area of science and science education. So I want to again provide you two examples of implementations that were really about having some photo sharing, some activities as the bedrock of what was the class activity. The first was something called Beetle Gallery. So I'm going to rip through these fairly quickly and hope you'll get a sense of them. So Beetle Gallery was done at Charles Sturt University. It was based on a traditional beetle collecting exercise, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the old traditional beetle collecting exercise. So this is in science where we're thinking about morphology and etymology of beetles. So that there was quite a bit of assessment associated with this. So that what would happen with this exercise is that students would traditionally go out and have to find a beetle and then describe it in a way associated with a standardised taxonomy. And so campus-based students and distance students were both in this. And rather than doing it by taking a beetle, and you know how you remember we'd go to the museum or you'd see a beetle with a pin on a pin board? So rather than put the beetle through all that shame and pain, is that they would take a photo of the beetle and then upload that to the learning management system, these students who are both campus-based and distance, and describe it using a particular taxonomy. And then they would share that amongst their community. The second one was in chemistry, and this happened at the University of Melbourne. The idea of this was that students are covering in their 101 chemistry a whole range of different concepts and principles. And what we wanted to do as part of a hurdle assessment is to ask students if there were 10 principles that they were covering in the first semester, they would go out into the everyday world and make it real and photograph an example of those principles, so oxidation or chiral objects or whatever it was. They would have to take 2 photographs of the principles that they chose, 2 out of 10, lots of students, and then upload them, and so that they could share them in this community online. And they would have to caption them like in a textbook, like a caption, and they'd have to comment on 2 other people's images. So that gives you a sense of those 2 tasks. Have I captured that okay? So here's the Beetle Gallery. I'm just going to whip through some images of what it looks like. It's in what was then the Charles Sturt University's learning management system. Pretty flat interface and sort of some folders there of the different types of beetles that people have collected. Nothing much to see. Here's the taxonomy that they had to fill in and then upload next to those. And here's a non-pinned beetle. Okay. Here's the Chem Flickr one we used at that time. Flickr was all the rage. Here's the interface to that one, a little bit more exciting chemistry around it. So you can see that students have put up these images. Here's an example of a chiral object that the student has put up and captioned, and there's comment. There was tag clouds, which was really cool because you could see that the ways in which people were tagging stuff, and unsurprisingly, the things that are coming out with the 10 principles that we'd hoped that they would cover. And I mean, it was one of the most gratifying things was just the number of wonderful examples that students came up with. That just like hundreds and hundreds of examples that students came up with that were examples of these concepts and principles that they were covering in their class. As part of the project, we had a standardised evaluation across these 9 case studies where we asked them those kind of questions that we always asked. How well did it help you understand? Did it make you reflect? Your ability to share your knowledge with other people, develop your thinking and research skills. And we did a comparison between these 2 tasks. So, which do you think came out ahead? The Beetle Gallery or who thinks that the Beetle Gallery came out ahead? Who thinks Chem Flickr came out ahead? Right, so the room is on side of Chem Flickr. Why? So the reason that we think that there was such a profound impact there, and if you look at comparison on the smilometer sort of ratings, in terms of interesting and ease of use and useful, again, Beetle Gallery really coming out ahead. So the reason that we think this is, that we wrote up, is that Beetle Gallery built on an existing task. It was a meaningful, integrated, aligned task within the curriculum. It was worth 30% of the mark. It was a small community. We found that students were seeing beetles from people who are out in Western New South Wales, because they were distance learners, that people in Sydney would never see. And they were learning a lot from somebody picking up a beetle on a dirt track compared to somebody picking up a beetle in Glebe. In Chem Flickr, students were saying things like, I study chemistry, not photography. Why are you making me go out and photograph all of these annoying things? Just let me get on and study. It's not aligned, it wasn't assessed, it was a hurdle requirement, they complained about it. So I think it's a really powerful and important message for us just in that example, and we can pick that up later. All right, here's my final example, and this is the whiz-bang gadgetry example. So this is a 3D immersive haptically rendered simulation environment. 3D immersive haptically rendered simulation environment. So the 3D bit is just the 3D environment, so that the ArtSec here is one of our surgical research fellows, is looking into a screen that is rendered in 3D. So the 3D glasses means that he can look down in and has depth perception. What he's looking at is the back of your head. Well, it's a bone at the back of your head, which is called the temporal bone, which is a sort of honeycomb type bone that sits behind your ear, that if you have any pathology with your hearing, or you need a cochlear implant, a surgeon will go into your head and drill that bone away, so that it would drill into the bone. And that's what ArtSec is doing. You can see what we call a probe in the middle of the ear, not in the middle of the bone. Can everybody see that on the screen? Which is got a round end. It's like a dentist's drill, and he's he's drilling out bone at the back behind the ear in the temporal bone. And that drill is connected to a device which is on the bench there, which is called a Falcon haptic device. A haptic device is something that provides force feedback to your hand. So when Yatsik is in the 3D immersive world and is looking at his drill bit drilling into the back of a bony head, when he hits the bone, he feels it in the device. It gives him pressure. Now it's honeycomb, so it's got a whole lot of little pockets. So if he's drilling away, he might drop into a pocket and he'll feel that through his device as well. A 3D immersive, haptically rendered digital environment, simulation environment. Cool. That's great. Did it make sense? Everyone with me? Good. All right. So the idea, the learning design of this task is learning for surgical trainees how to complete what we call a cortical mastoidectomy, which is drill away the bone behind the ear, but do it safely. So it's a procedural simulation task. It picks up on a whole lot of skills that students need to have, psychomotor, procedural and decision-making skills, and obviously deeply immersive, interactive, authentic, adaptive digital learning environment. Suddenly my clicker doesn't work. There we go. So I will skip over the does it work thing. We've published quite a lot in the area. What we've found particularly works is it improves students' procedural skills and their ability to undertake the surgery, particularly before going into what we call the OR lab, where they do it on cadavers. So it's cadavers and surgeons' time, so severed heads and bones, are very, very expensive and a scarce resource. And what you find is that students go in and they mess it up, really quickly. And so if we can do some pre-training so that they have a level of skills before going and working with expensive heads, like the surgeons and the temporal bones, then we're doing a good job. And we've published a little bit about that. So I'll skip over that bit. But what I really want to talk about for the last bit is this idea of an adaptive digital learning environment and share with you some of the things that we're doing about how we're trying to make this environment adaptive. And this really goes back to that mutual adaptivity that I was sort of explaining before, where the environment responds to what the individual is inputting into the environment and changes as a result of it. And so what we wanted to do is use the records of students' interactions within the environment to provide personalised adaptive feedback. And this is how we did it. So within the environment, because it's all digitally rendered, we're taking metrics out of the environment all the time. So as it says at the bottom of the slide, 15 records of 48 metrics per second. Think about that. 15 records of 48 metrics per second. So that's a lot. That's coming out, streams and streams of data coming out of this system. And the data that we're bringing out of the system are things like this: how far away from anatomical structures, how much force you're applying on the head, on the bone, on the temporal bone, the stroke length. So stroke is the way in which you move the drill in the environment. Are you doing these to be avoided stabby strokes, or are you doing nice, long, smooth strokes which are not going to take your ear off? And things like just how you're positioning the head. So we're taking all that data out of the system. And what we wanted to do with Stephen and James and Ioana and Siddhanthi and Yatsik and Yun, big research team, is work out how we could mine those interactions in real time, take the data out of the system in real time, build up models of novice and expert behaviour, and then use that to provide feedback to students while they're in the environment to direct their behaviour. So it's sort of like this, is we built these two models of novice and expert behaviour. A new student comes into the system, they look all right, they're sort of like the expert. At a certain point, they start deviating towards what we would regard, based on the metrics, as novice-type behaviour, and then we provide them with some sort of feedback. Okay? Putting it another way, there's Yatsik drilling out the bone. We're taking buckets and buckets of data out of the system out here to the right. We're doing these fancy algorithmic work of Markov model and random forest models and nearest neighbour techniques on the metrics as they're coming out. We built a separate application, which is a little assessment application to work out when we provide the feedback, so we're not like Microsoft paperclip saying, you look like you're writing a letter. So that we're timing it, so that we're not saying, you look like you're drilling out the back of it. And then we provide auditory feedback, which is Maybe you should slow down. Do you know you're getting close to the juror? Maybe you should drill in parallel to the juror now that you've located it. Those kind of things, which we're emulating what a surgeon who was sitting next to a trainee would say if they were sitting on their shoulder, and we provide that. We did a test of this with 24 medical students who had some knowledge of anatomy but not of surgery, and we just did a simple two-group comparison. And quite unsurprisingly in some ways, the bottom scale is the degree to which the procedure is completed. The y-axis is the degree to which the behaviour looks like that of an expert surgeon. And you can see that the blue line is significantly different from the red line, and that those with the feedback did better than those that didn't have the feedback. And you might say, yeah, give people feedback, they'll do a little bit better. I just want to remind you, this is entirely automated on the basis of what they're doing. There's no human intervention here. And so we were really, really pleased with this result. So, wrapping it up and coming full circle. So I made the argument that we concentrate on the wrong thing when thinking about the role of technology in higher education, and that often we focus on the wrong thing. We need to focus on interactivity and interaction, and often we fail to design for interaction. And what I've tried to do is show you through those examples how those examples are good examples of designing for these kinds of interaction that I've argued is important. And hopefully you can see through my explanation of the way in which I've unpacked those examples, sometimes maybe in boring detail, is that underpinning all of those are these wonderful pedagogical models that you would all be familiar with. Different types of learning designs: collaborative, role play, situated, simulated, authentic, peer-based, problem-based, apprenticeship models. The list would go on, and they are familiar to you. It's not like we have to work hard to find good pedagogical models that we can use to design our teaching and learning practice. So I want to just finish by basically repeating myself. And these are the summary of really what I'm trying to impart today. The first is that, remember the fourfold classification. I think it's really important to remember that education technologies, and the inverted commas there is for a reason, have different roles or values. We're often duped into thinking that it's sort of one thing. And universities have tended to focus on the use of technology to support those access and management and resource exchange kind of reasons. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but we need to continually remind ourselves that we need to use technology to support these genuine, generative, interactive teaching and learning environments. The second thing is that learning design is king. The pedagogical design of our digital environments is the key to their success. It's not the technology. Meaningful interaction between students, among students and teachers, and between students and content is curriculum. And there's well-designed frameworks to advise us on what we need to do in these areas. The third summary point is that constructive alignment is queen. So the Beetle example, I think, really drives that home. The learning objectives that we set, the design of the task and the meaningfulness of it, and the assessment of it need to be aligned. And if you combine that with good learning design, which is the constructive bit, my clicker's stopped working. When you combine that with good learning design, it really just comes into Biggs's notion of constructive alignment, which again, I'm sure you're familiar with. Fourth, when you've got those two things in place, learning design and constructive alignment, the technology really does recede into the background. I know it's sort of a trite thing to say, or something that is said too often, but if you put it another way, you don't need really super duper technology to create digital, really high and powerful digital learning experiences. And exceptional learning design can be enacted with even the most modest technologies, or even, dare I say it, no technology. And finally, just a hint of the future, learning analytics or logging students' interactions can be a really powerful tool to just show what students are doing with the environments we design and how they're interacting with them, but also with real applications in the area of understanding, intervening in the learning process, providing feedback and providing support to students. So, the start of the talk, Messiah or myth. I think that in conclusion, one of the ways we often think about educational technologies is in this way. We think about it in terms of the technology. We're often talking about MOOCs or, certainly in the conversations that I have, particularly in the sort of senior executive, what are we doing in online learning? What are we doing in MOOCs? Are we going to miss out on social media? What kind of multimedia do we use in our courses? We often have a conversation which starts at this point, which I think is sort of understandable in many ways because it is the thing that's in the headlines. It is the Pokemon Go of today. It is an easy entry point for us to have the conversation, to talk about these things. So I think it's understandable. But really, if we want to turn that myth into a messiah, we've got to change the nature of the debate. We've got to change the nature of the conversation so that if we're going to get a messiah out of this thing, it needs to be a conversation that's dominated by learning design, by constructive alignment, by thinking about the affordances of the technology, not the technology in themselves. And importantly, thinking about how you can apply them in different ways for different content areas, different discipline areas for different students, which I haven't talked about much, but is another part of the equation. And I think if we get those things right, we've got a much better chance of achieving some sort of systemic change with technology in our universities and across higher education. That's it. Thanks so much.
What can I say? Gregor, thank you very much for bringing us your insights, and as you said yourself, and a lot of the things that you did say are things that many of us understand and assert as we go through our own institutions, but having them so deeply nested in research and real lived experience and demonstrable, which is such an important part of the academic life that we all live and lead, I think adds great value and great resonance. Now, Gregor didn't quite use up the full 4 hours that I had allocated to him. So we do have some time for questions. There are a couple of my LTC colleagues who you will see in red shirts who have microphones. Could I please ask that you introduce yourself to Gregor, tell him who you are and what faculty you're in or what discipline you're from, just so that we know who he can know who he's talking to. So, does anybody have any questions?
Excellent.
We'll be paying him for this, don't let him off too easily. Peter, a colleague here, and then Peter.
Oh, hi, I'm Maggie. I'm in the School of Arts up in Brisbane. Great presentation. And I suppose my question is, looking at that quadrant, and I totally agree, but I think one of the reasons why 1 and 2 are used is because you can actually learn that stuff in about a 2-hour workshop.
Yeah.
And I think 3, I think when online stuff came in, there was this perception that it was going to be just it would be really easy, people would make heaps of money out of it, and it was going to... And so that stuff, educational design, but you also, even if the technology is just there to support that, it still needs to be learned and understood. And I guess, so how you go from the idea that we need to do that to doing it is a massive, massive commitment, and and I am kind of in a management role. How you go from that to that? I mean, I feel totally overwhelmed by it, and let alone kind of then asking my staff to do it. That for me is the really difficult. I love all this stuff, but I feel really overwhelmed even looking at what you've been doing. I mean, not in a bad way, but...
No, and we talked about this last night at dinner, that it's all very well to sort of say this, but how do you do it? How do you operationalise it? So I can talk briefly about some of the strategies that we use. So this is moving on from the sort of the high-level conceptual framework and the lovely research that is funded by someone else to thinking about an institution with 45,000 students and 7,500 staff. How do you actually affect change across that institution? So I think that's a really good question. So the thing that we do is, and you can take it at a different levels. So, you know, and Kevin would have structured approaches to this through the learning and teaching area of the institution, and providing as much structure as you can in terms of professional development. But it needs to be very targeted. So some of the things that we do is that we don't overwhelm, so we restrict the band of what we're going to focus on. So we have, for example, in our Learning and Teaching Initiative grants, which I just reviewed yesterday, we have very specific things that we're asking people to respond to in any call. So it might be dealing with large lectures, technology to deal with large lectures. We're only interested in that, and we can tell you what we're interested in. We've moved away from, we will let all flowers bloom over here and come up with your good ideas. But if you are interested in making your large, medium and large group teaching and learning experiences more interactive and engaging, and you're prepared to consider these 5 things, we're interested in hearing from you, and we'll give you a grant to do it. So there's one example. The structure of the programs that we have in the Centre for Study of Higher Education is another way, similarly, that they're defined. Some are generic, some are general. How do you teach online? Others are much more specific. How do you provide feedback online? And the third thing that we talked about a little bit last night was, and it's hard because it takes time, which none of us have, but it is an imperative for me, which is that if you are speaking to individual academic staff or teaching staff who have got responsibilities for teaching and learning that are resistant to change or don't know how to change, the conversation is often usefully started by, what is it that gives you grief at the moment? What is your biggest problem at the moment? What do you not enjoy about the fact that you've got 500 biochemistry students or 360 fine art students or whatever it is? And you start at that point and they say, well, it's marking 600 essays over a 2-week period so they get them into the centralised. And you say, well, maybe we can use that as a starting point for thinking about how you could use technology in your teaching and learning and build on it from there. So there are a couple of the things that but it is a really tricky issue to affect change in systemic ways in large institutions. It's a real challenge for all of us.
Thank you, Gregor. Any other questions? Yeah, probably have time for one more at the back. Ned, if you again introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. Ned or Nerita Blair from the School of Education. Gregor, thank you very much for your presentation.
Pleasure.
I'm still framing my thoughts, so this may come out a bit muddled, but that's normal anyway, I guess. I wonder when we're dealing with this where the humanness or the human element is in this. And I'm reflecting on your comment about the students on the lawn not working. If I was to look at the pedagogical design of that, I see a whole lot of deep listening, reflection, paying attention, relatedness, connections, building. The context that I'm thinking about is not operating on people's bones, but operating on people's attitudes and dealing with racism. You know, those sort of attitudinal changes that impact on people's values and really deep inner core stuff, spirit stuff, I suppose. So I guess I'm just wondering where that sits in all of this.
Yeah, so I think that's, a sort of profound question in many ways, and again, comes to some of the conversations that we were having last night at dinner. So the first thing is to say is that the students on the lawn was a throwaway gag to get the room going. And I said it with deep apologies to my colleagues in the front row here. The second thing is that I think you're absolutely right, and I'm a big proponent of this, particularly in the undergraduate years, of the scholarly community on campus, and that the in-between spaces and the informal learning that occurs in the environments that we create on campus that give a sense of presence and place on campus are incredibly important to the enterprise, particularly the undergraduate teaching and learning experience in higher education. And I think we need to take that seriously. And so by presence and place, I mean create places that resonate with the individual and have meaning for the individual, and also had meaning in a different way, which is that they engender meaning making in the ways that you're talking about rubbing up against people, not literally, but rubbing up against people who are different from us, who challenge us, who make us think differently about things. Now, the question about the role of technology in that one is tricky. So part of it is to think that technology doesn't have a role in it, and part of me thinks that the physical scholarly community on campus is incredibly important and provides an avenue to get at the kind of things that you're talking about. But there are affordances of technology that allow you to do similar things in online environments, and often are coupled with physical environments. So I'll just give you one example, and I'm worried about the time, is that geolocation services, the idea that you're carrying around a mobile phone that knows where you are, knows that you're on a physical campus, and is able to work out what is around you. One of the projects that I had a master's student in this area, was thinking about ways in which you can use that technology affordance to put people in contact with other people that they might not ordinarily be in contact with, and to show them events and activities on campus that they might not go. So let's say, for example, that you're doing a medical degree, and in the history and philosophy and science, there's a lecture on the ethics of euthanasia, but you would never know that there was a public lecture on euthanasia because you're in your medical world and it's across campus. But a smart device that is geolocated, that is context aware, would be able to say to you, you've got an hour off in your curriculum, you could go and meet with the 3 people over there that are part of your medical tutorial, and at the same time, in 10 minutes' time, there's a public lecture on the other side of campus about euthanasia, which you've been studying in your clinical practice tutes 3 weeks ago. Are you interested? And in a way, it's the coupling of the two, the physical environment, the richness of the environment, the need for us to encourage students to push themselves beyond their localised boundaries so that we combat things like racism and terrorism and global warming and refugees and immigration. If we're able to facilitate that more with technology, I think that we've had a win.
We will have to wrap it up there, I'm afraid, colleagues, because we are at time. Please, again, join me in thanking Gregor.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Right, super. Thank you. I'll get off this one.
Some small tokens in acknowledgement and consistent with our Catholic identity and tradition of being generous in saying thank you. So thank you.
Thank you.